I'm delighted to welcome our longtime collaborator and guest lecturer, Dr. Mark Pottinger, to the Met-Ed Zoomosphere, as I like to call it. Mark is professor of music and musicology and chair of the music and theater department at Manhattan College, where he founded the Sound Studies program, which is a unique area of music study at the intersection of musicology, performance, audio technology, and the science of sound. So I think these are all things we could geek out on in this group. I think we could agree on that. So Professor Pottinger is also the author of numerous publications on the music and cultural life of 19th century Europe, opera, and the contemporary listening environment. And he is currently completing a book on Donizetti's opera Lucia di Lammermoor, which will be published by Cambridge University Press in 2024. A lover of all things French, Professor Pottinger teaches in Paris during the summers, presenting lectures and sound walks at several historic venues throughout the city. So take it away, Mark. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. This is great, and it's always wonderful to talk to fellow educators about the world of music, but also of opera, and especially this particular opera, Don Giovanni, or The Rake Punished. And I really wanted to open up with this slide, not only of Peter Mattei, the bass baritone, who premieres next month, Don Giovanni in the title role. But I wanted to have the full title here, or The Rake Punished, because I think we think of Don Giovanni as just simply Don Giovanni, but it actually has this other title, or The Rake Punished. And I think that's a very important point, because the reality is that this work, as we were talking about Champion, there's language there that can make that is difficult for young people to perhaps to stomach, to deal with, to think about. And Don Giovanni has a lot of violence, sexual abuse, murder, it goes on and on in terms of the evil things that are done by this individual. But the reality is that he is punished. And the fact is that this work is dealing with social justice. It's all about justice. It's not just Don Giovanni, this evil guy, this rake, this trickster, this libertine, but it's also about the fact that justice is had upon him. And so that's something just to remember, especially this concept of this work. It brings up so many maybe trigger moments. And I remember teaching this in one of my classes and having to introduce the opera by talking about that it begins with a rape, begins with sexual abuse right at the very start, and a murder. So how do we handle that? But I think the fact is that Don Giovanni is an apex predator in a world that has no one like him. And notice his outfit here. This is Ivo van Hove, who is the theater director who's doing this premiere for the Met next month. And it's all about, if we think about individuals today who have license to do whatever they want, no justice is upon them, they're able to slip and slide, even though things they do that are bad, people see it, they're able to slip out of any sense of justice. These are politicians. You notice that he's dressed as a politician, not as an 18th century nobleman. So I think the fact that we can talk about justice, the individuals who seem to elude justice, I think that the production, but also me being aware of this title, the Rake Punished, this idea, the subtitle that continues with this work, it's all about the idea of finding justice for this individual, this rogue individual, this apex predator who has no one else like him, a Tyrannosaurus Rex, if you will, of this world that no one can challenge. And so in a sense, heavens have to open up to deal with them. To begin with, within this work, I wanted to talk about sort of its source. It comes from 1630, written by this individual right here, Tirso de Molina. And with Tirso de Molina, he was a Catholic monk born in Spain, and really are in that period of the Baroque period. And those of you who've ever taught art history and music history know so much about the Baroque period. It's an age that deals with a political reality of absolutism, or this idea that one individual defines all aspects of society. The characteristic individual, of course, Louis XIV of France. He said, "I am the state. As I wake, so does France. As I go to bed, so does France." This reality that all things are defined by this one absolute ruler. And so this is the Baroque world that Tirso is writing in. And he's an individual who, even though he's a Catholic monk, he was also very much fluent in arts and literature. And he was a very prolific playwright, as well as writer of short stories. And one of the things that he often would do would take everyday situations, but how they're integrated directly with the supernatural, or with God or the devil. This idea of realities happening in the everyday are sort of subjugated to the worlds of basically of heaven and hell. So this idea of looking the fact that his stories deal with the fact of everyday individuals caught up in larger than life situations, almost the very idea of Baroque, this over the top reality. And that term, once again, Baroque, a Portuguese term, Barroco, misshapen pearl. It's a goldsmith term. And as you get a pearl that's overly wrought, overly sort of developed to a point where it no longer becomes beautiful, becomes gaudy, becomes ugly. It was an 18th century term looking back at this period and seeing it as so overly wrought, so overly embellished that it no longer becomes anything but moves you to emotion and moves you to a sense of being overwhelmed. Doesn't speak to reason, but rather speaks to an irrational emotion, basically being manipulated, an aesthetic, basically to sort of create this system of manipulation, to create a feeling where you're moved to awe. And this is very much defined in his text, The Trickster of Seville. And then in this particular text, you have and the stone guest. And notice that it has right there at the start that the title of this individual is not, Don Juan, it's the trickster. It's all about this individual who either a trickster, a rake, or even the idea of someone who is a libertine. Different ways of that the translation of Lorenzo da Ponte and Mozart's opera have been defined. It's this idea of this trickster, this rake, this libertine, someone who constantly is challenging the status quo. And that sense of challenging the status quo is at the heart of what makes this work being so defined. And one of the things about this text is that, as we mentioned, it has this idea of the there we go, of the stone guest. And in this image, you see this idea of the supernatural coming alive and taking down Giovanni. That very idea, it's a very rational concept. The idea that even the heavens open up and bring down this individual. It's so Baroque in that idea that this idea that the metaphysics or sort of the everyday reality that we see, there's something else behind it. And basically the actions that we do sort of cause even the angels to weep, the gods to respond. And that's very much a part of what you see in Baroque opera and also in this Baroque story coming here from 1630. And this very idea of Don Giovanni, this individual who, or Don Juan, we often sort of focus on the fact that he's a sexual predator. He constantly is someone who's obsessed with sex, obsessed with women and trying to manipulate them for his own desires. The fact that he, as many of you know, at the end of the opera, he chooses to go to hell. The fact that he doesn't waver. So many times he's asked, change your ways, change your ways. Even Donna Elvira, she is the one woman, and many actually scholars argue that she's pregnant with his child, and she wants him to come to him, and she's willing to forgive him. She's one of the only individuals in the opera that seeks to forgive him and to find ways for him to come back to her. Even right before the guest of the stone guest, the commendatore, the father that's killed at the beginning of the opera, comes back in the form of this stone statue. She comes to him right before that happens and says, try to change your ways. I still love you. Come to me. And he still responds in a sense, no, I'm basically Don Giovanni. The fact that he doesn't change, the fact he doesn't repent, the fact that he continues in his pursuit highlights very much for many people from this period on, from 1630 on, philosophers, artists, musicians continually try to figure out, who is this guy? Why does he not change his ways? He's someone who challenges the status quo. Is he to be celebrated? Is he a hero? He chooses death over changing his ways. Is that something that we should admonish? And that's sort of at the heart of this character. And I think we continually sort of, every generation finds new ways to try to figure out, who is this individual and why does he not repent? And the fact he doesn't repent continues this desire to try to figure out what makes him so focused in what he does. Why does he have this will to continue on to doing what he does? And this is one of the things I think that highlights for many individuals throughout the 19th century and even into our own time in the 21st century. Now, I have this image. You might say, who's this? Well, this is James I. He's the one who wrote the king, well, is sponsored the authors to write the King James Version of the Bible. 1611 did this come out, around the same time that we have Tirso de Molina. And just to highlight for those of you who want to focus on Don Giovanni, to bring forth the idea of the source texts that are around the time that Molina is running. Cervantes, of course, Don Quixote is a classic work that was written around the same time, as was the King James Version. That very of the Bible, and that very idea, no, thou shalt bring forth thy soul, the very idea of this language that goes beyond the everyday, hyperbole, trying to persuade you not with rational thought, but rather with emotion, to overwhelm you to a point where you're just so convinced by the power of these words, the poetry of the words, that you're moved to an emotion. And the King James Version of the Bible highlights so much of that Baroque aesthetic that we find in Molina's tale and the very idea of the story of the Stone Guest. And I just wanted to have this image here. This is an image which very much highlights, and is here, it's Charles II, around 1674. It very much highlights that Baroque aesthetic. And those of you who are Anglophiles, I'm a bit of a Francophile, but also maybe a little bit of an Anglophile. But Charles III, his inauguration, of course, is next month. And the very idea of having an individual stand above with coronation, with golden chariots, with trumpets, and it goes beyond rational thought. And this is that Baroque idea. Now, the very idea of when we had George I and George II, it's the time of Handel. Handel wrote the coronation music that's used for the British family still to this day, that Baroque sound of overwhelming you with one idea, continuing to replicate it over and over and over again, to a point where you're just so overwhelmed. Like the idea I often use with my students when I talk about Baroque is like saying, I love you. I really love you. I really, really love you, to a point where it's like, I get it. You love me. And it's that sense of constantly repeating some idea to a point where you're overwhelmed and moved, affected, internal change. And this is very much a sense here. This is, here we have this king who had basically signed a treaty with Holland. And you see Neptune carrying him on the seas, the sense that somehow his actions that are sponsored by angels, by cherubs, with gods, so the everyday actions of the powerful replicate or sort of reverberate into the world of gods and goddesses. So this is very much the world that we find of Molina, and very much highlights, I think, that Baroque idea that we see being carried over into the 18th century with the story of Don Giovanni and the rake punished. I don't have time for this, but one of the things we're just the sonic reality of that Baroque. Many of you who've ever taught music history know about the fugue. It's a characteristic element. Don't have it in the Renaissance. You don't have it in the medieval period, but you do have in the Baroque. So that very desire to overwhelm you with one idea over and over and over again, to a point where you're not moved to any rational thought, but moved to being overwhelmed. That was the whole idea, sort of what you might say the metaphysics of counterpoint. Counterpoint was all the idea of trying to create constant idea of overlapping lines. And the metaphysics of that, as Bach would talk about the idea that every piece he wrote, Jesu Juva, or God helps, or Solo Deo Gloria, only to God be the glory. He would write this at every piece. This whole point is that as you hear his music, you're overwhelmed and brought to sort of a respect or majesty of God. And all that is a very Baroque sonic reality that highlights the aesthetics, not only of Molina, but also of this period which brought forth the text, the trickster and the stone guest. So bring us basically to the 18th century. So move us 150 years later, after Tirso de Molina wrote Don Juan or Don Giovanni, and the story that we have for the opera that you will see next month. So Lorenzo da Ponte, fascinating figure. His date 1749 to 1838. If we had more time, I'd talk so much about his life. He actually ended up in New York. He was a grocer, and then he started an opera company, which eventually closed. And we had the Academy of New York, the Academy of Music Academy, that closed. And eventually, what we have is Metropolitan Opera. He built the first standing alone, opera-built theater, rather than a theater that accommodated opera. He was part of the group that first brought opera to the United States. He was the one who actually premiered Don Giovanni in 1826. So in New York. So he actually became a registered citizen of the United States in 1833. So he lived a very long life, and he actually died in New York, and he's buried in southern Manhattan. So it's really a fascinating story about Lorenzo da Ponte. He was born a Jew. He was born in the large ghetto, Jewish ghetto in Venice. His father was a widower, and his father married a Catholic woman, and he converted to Catholicism, as did his three sons. And Lorenzo da Ponte was the oldest of those three sons. He went to seminary and also became a priest. And he was baptized in 1759, just 10 years after his birth in 1749. And so his first place where he became a priest, or he was positioned, was Venice, that very same hometown. And there in Venice, he gave mass. He continued to engage directly with the populace in terms of faith, but also of ideas. He was a writer. He was writing stories and plays. He was translating Latin, French, and Italian. And there in Venice, he also apparently, similar perhaps what attracted him to Tirso de Molina's story, he was a man who also had several mistresses. He actually lived in a brothel. This is a priest, and he lived in a brothel. And he actually was kicked out of Venice in 1779, and he was charged with public concubinage and abduction of a respectable woman. So this is Lorenzo da Ponte. This is our figure. He was banned from Venice, a very liberal city, mind you, in Italy, for 15 years. And so where does he go? Goes to Vienna. And there in Vienna, he actually comes across a friend, a fellow Italian, Antonio Salieri. Those of you who know Amadeus know about this individual, Salieri. He was the court composer, of course, for Joseph II. Joseph II was the Holy Roman Emperor. He was a lover of music. He was stationed there in Vienna, had theaters, had a love of stories, a passion of opera. And there in 1781, Lorenzo da Ponte, he meets Joseph II. This is his brother Leopold II, who follows Joseph II when he dies in 1790. So we have Joseph II, the one in the center, who is the Holy Roman Emperor, and Salieri was his court composer. Salieri introduces Lorenzo da Ponte, a fellow Italian, to Joseph II, who loved Italian opera, loved Italian plays. He actually had an Italian theater, Italian language theater there in Vienna. And so Lorenzo da Ponte started working for him at writing plays and also writing Italian librettos for Salieri and for other composers. He actually wrote 28 operas and with 11 different composers. So it just highlights Lorenzo da Ponte's life in terms of writing directly for the stage. So he was well known in terms of a writer and a playwright. And following the time of his time there in 1781, we also have Mozart, of course. Mozart arrives the same year as Lorenzo da Ponte in 1781. Those of you who know the story and history of Mozart know that he was a child prodigy, the son of Leopold Mozart, as you see here with the violin. His mother, who died in 1778, she's pictured here, a woman by the name of Anna Maria. Mozart, she died actually when Mozart was on tour in Paris, and there she died. Next to Mozart is his sister, Maria Anna, who was also known as Nannerl. She also was a child prodigy on the instrument, but it was Mozart who was the one from age 8 to about age 15, basically toured as a child prodigy, with his father always serve as his manager. So he arrives in 1781 after a time living in Salzburg. Many of you know probably the story of Mozart. Here's the Archbishop of Salzburg, an individual who basically did not appreciate sort of the celebrity culture that was surrounding his servant here, Mozart, and Mozart didn't desire any more of sort of the lack of attention to his ability. He goes to Vienna in 1781, and there in Vienna, he meets Lorenzo da Ponte. About 1785, he meets them. And in 1786, they produced their first opera, The Marriage of Figaro, in 1786. This picture dates from 1779. Actually, it was it's a version of this one that was done later in the 19th century. So this was the actual portrait in 1779. And it was commissioned to do a new portrait in the 19th century, and they took that and they sort of revised it. But it's around the same time, 1779, and 1781, just 2 years later, is Mozart in Vienna. So we get sort of an idea what Mozart looked like at this particular time. Born in 1756, so he's about 24, 25 years old when he first arrives there in Vienna. And the performance of The Marriage of Figaro takes place at this particular theater. This is known as the Burgtheater in Michaelerplatz there in Vienna. And this is the place where the Marriage of Figaro, also Così fan tutte, premiered as well, the other opera that Mozart and Lorenzo da Ponte worked on. So great performance there at Marriage of Figaro in 1786. Great success. Mozart goes to Prague to put it on. Great success there. Commissioned to write another opera. And that another opera, it happens to be Don Giovanni in 1787. And in October of 1787, it premiered in Prague. And what's curious, and I have this little picture here just to indicate, this is the composer Giuseppe Gazzaniga. He was a kind of an interesting individual. He was the one who wrote the opera Don Giovanni or The Stone Guest, which premiered just about 6 months prior to Don Giovanni by Mozart and Lorenzo da Ponte. So Lorenzo da Ponte borrowed the libretto from this particular opera by this particular composer, Giuseppe Gazzaniga, and that premiered in Venice in 1787, earlier that year. And then we have Lorenzo basically redefined the work for Mozart's setting, but also used Tirso de Molina as also his source. So it filled out some more ideas using the source text, Tirso de Molina, and then also the libretto associated with this earlier version here by our Italian composer Giuseppe Gazzaniga in Venice. What's interesting, Lorenzo da Ponte never mentioned this. It was only through research by scholars that they were able to find out that actually Lorenzo actually borrowed from another opera to produce Don Giovanni, but also filled it out with ideas associated with Tirso de Molina. So the work premiered in 1787, in October of 1787, and this is the Estates Theater or Staatstheater there in Prague. This is where the work premiered, as it was commissioned by the impresario there at the theater, who wanted, after the great success of Marriage of Figaro, wanted another opera, and they produced this particular work. Mozart loved his time in Prague, actually. Those of you know perhaps a little bit of the history of Mozart. He writes one of his great symphonies, Symphony number 38, known as the Prague Symphony, which premiered here in Prague as well. And if you go to Prague, you'll also see a statue right next to the theater, which is dedicated to the Commendatore. So it sort of highlights the premiere that took place here in October 29th of 1797. So it's really a fascinating sort of little walk down history lane here with the story of how Molina first comes to this tale through the Baroque world of having this idea of larger than life realities define themselves in the everyday actions of individuals, that things are defined in ways that go beyond the everyday to such a point where they're sort of hyperbolic in terms of their reality. So one is moved to emotion rather than reason. And then we move to the 18th century when this work is performed. And one of the things about this period, 1787, many of you know, this is the signing of the Constitution of the United States, 1787. This is a 20th century painting in 1940 by Howard Chandler Christie. But this is of the 1787 event that took place, the signing of the Constitution, and just a very idea of what Constitution means for a new republic. It's all about the laws that define all of us, no matter who we are, high or low. Universal principles of justice, universal principles of how one should define their moral actions, ethical realities. All that is taking place in 1787, the very year that we have Don Giovanni. So bringing it directly into the US constitutional history, I think is an important point for your students, because this is a work, once again, the rake punished. This evil doer has to be punished in this world of Enlightenment justice as well. In the Baroque world of justice, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit, but the sense that of getting it in the context of the Enlightenment, I think is important. Of course, 1789, a couple of years after the premiere of Don Giovanni, and those of you who know the opera, they sing a chorus, Libertà, Libertà, and they sing a chorus associating with liberty, justice, liberté, égalité, fraternité. Those are the words of the French Revolution, of course. They're already in firmament at this particular time in the 1780s, and certainly here in 1789, July 14th, the storming the Bastille in Paris, basically destroying of the prison that is at the center place of Paris. And of course, this follows in about a month later with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen there in 1789, just in August 1789, which are simple principles. But the idea that one's individual's own desires and fate and destiny is defined by themselves, not by others, not by some distant ruler. And that's at the heart of this Enlightenment idea of justice, that the individual and the sense of freedom is every aspect. And to get into a little bit here of the philosophy of ideas, this is Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant, around in the 1780s, wrote Critique of Pure Reason, wrote about ideas of universal principles of justice. And I'm not quite sure how much Kant might be for some of your students, but the reality is that his thought is very dense and sometimes a little bit opaque. But the ideas that he brings forth speaks directly to the sense that we find in Don Giovanni. And I just want to read a little bit from his theory on justice. We cannot compel others to be virtuous, since virtue presupposes a free act of the will. But we can compel others to observe the rules of justice, to punish those who violate the rights of others. And this is at the heart of his universal principle of justice. He tried to look not to the church or to the rights of individuals who are wealthy or noble, but rather finding justice that is universal, defining for all. So based on reason and rationality, rather than the ideas associated with the sacred or the secular. And so in this world of justice is what we find, what's happening here in the 1780s, trying to find ways, how does one become a citizen in a world where we came from, where absolute rulers define everything. Now we look to each other. Now we look to ourselves. How do we now, outside the church, come to ways to understand justice? And I have this image here of Rikers Island. I taught Don Giovanni at Rikers Island in fall 2018. I worked with a colleague in religious studies, and we were looking basically at issues of social justice. And one of the things that we did, we actually had 3 operas. We had Monteverdi's Orfeo, Mozart's Don Giovanni, and Gershwin's Porgy and Bess. We had 10 inmates there at Rikers Island, and not to go into the history of Rikers Island or anything like that, but it's a fascinating place, and because they deal with the realities of justice or injustice every day. And so bringing up this issue of social justice in these works, one of the things about Monteverdi's Orfeo, which is around 1607, fantastic opera, one of the earliest of all operas. One of the things around the time also of Molina's text is that we have Orpheus, an individual who's the son of Apollo. So you might say he's a noble. He's gifted with talent beyond all. He has the ability with music to charm anything, any wild beast, and he's able to engage directly with that power and to live a life of charm and excess. He's married, he loses his wife, and so with his power, he goes to hell to bring her back. He's given one rule, not to break, but he breaks it. He basically does wrong. He basically breaks the law. Why does he do it? Why does he have that Orphic moment? Why does he look back in the land of the dead? No living eye shall see, so look upon the land of dead. But he does it. And by doing so, he believes and, he rationalizes his ideas, say, well, it's love. I'm doing this because of love. So that trumps everything. So there's no law opposed to me. I'm doing it for love. And what happens? He looks back, he loses Eurydice forever, gone forever. But his father, Apollo, basically scoops him up and then brings him up to heaven. So in a sense, our individual here is able to live a life of ease and to reflect upon his power. This Baroque world associated with the powerful are able to have the gods respond to their actions. Moving it towards Don Giovanni. Now, the fact is that Don Giovanni, as I mentioned before, he continues, he's a noble. He's an individual that continues to do what he does without any recourse. He has complete sense of lack of immorality, a total lack of morality, a total sense of immorality in his actions. And the thing about, as compared to what we find in the Baroque, this idea with Monteverdi's Orfeo, where he looks back and sees this reality happen and his father saves him and reflected of his noble power. With Don Giovanni, what happens to him? But he is swallowed up by that very force that saved Orpheus before. It basically takes him down. The sense that it applies itself to this idea of justice. No matter who you are, basically you will receive the same level of justice for an action that goes against all others. The sense of what we find in Don Giovanni, this reality of an individual who continues to pursue his actions without any sense of ethics or any sense of repentance of any sorts. He's given so many options to repent, to change his actions, but he doesn't do it. And I think with this idea, and you see this with Peter Mate, I think it's a fantastic portrait with showing his forehead and this out in his sort of politician uniform. It sort of highlights that reality so much, I think, in terms of the ideas associated with an individual who feels as if they have no sense of, doesn't have to respond to the laws of the day, but rather does what they desire, basically out of their own sense of will. And just want to leave you this one last image. And I know my time is running out, but this is one last image. This is sort of showcases the singers that are in the opera. And these are the ones that are performing next month in the Met. Just wanted to highlight in red, these are their character types or voice types, their Fach, if you will, but they're also reflective of these stock characters. Like a situation comedy, when an individual like Kramer runs into a room, you know exactly what he's up to. He's a bassa buffo. He's a fool. Whatever he says, what's happened, whatever situation, before he opens his mouth, you know the reality. And this is what we have with Mozart. He situates each of the voices all in different realities, being a dramatic soprano, a woman who has been hurt by the world, basically an individual who has a strong soprano voice with a very angular-like quality in terms of their ability to sing. The lyric soprano, someone very legato, and often having a naive individual, a young woman who is yet to define themselves in the world. We see this with Donna Elvira, a woman who constantly forgives Don Giovanni, while others are like, what's going on here? This guy has to receive justice. All the way to soubrette soprano. This is, of course, a flirtatious individual. These are the character types, almost like, once again, as if they were stock characters in a story. And no matter the situation, you put them in that situation, they respond in that way. And that's sort of the fascinating things about this work, how in spite of all this idea of justice, the Baroque tale that finds its way in the 18th century, but also how Mozart plays with the conventions of the day. You expect the basso profundo, for example, to be a serious bass, one of command. And he continues to use that, but how the characters play in that role when justice for all these individuals are all demanding upon one individual, Don Giovanni, everyone, Zerlina, Don Anna, Don Elvira, Leporello, they're all wanting justice. And only by killing Don Giovanni is justice received. And the very final moment of the opera, we have the ensemble where all the characters come together and say, now that Don Giovanni is dead, now we can move forth our lives. And it's almost like idea that now balance is restored, symmetry in life, justice, social justice is now been sort of, finds its way and finds its way in society in such a way that they all can move forth. So it's a fascinating opera. You can look at it from very different ways, from the Baroque to the 18th century, but also perhaps to our own day. The idea, how is justice received on individuals who continue to elude justice? What are we to do with that individual? And Mozart and Lorenzo da Ponte's response is basically the heavens have to respond. For this individual, we have no sort of laws to deal with someone who is so rogue in how they continue to do their actions. All right, so there we are. Sorry, my time went over just a little. Apologize for that.
That was amazing.
I had so much to say. I'm sorry, but it was just like,
you know what? I'm gonna come to visit one of your classes. You're gonna find me in Manhattan College, just wandering around trying to
right. Come.
Visit your lectures. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time. Thank you for being with us.